Well, hello everyone. It is 12 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. We'll begin with some introductions and which will give folks a little bit of time to join the room here for today's webinar. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Shane Barton. I'm the Downtown Revitalization and Brownfield Redevelopment Coordinator for the Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. And I've got some great guests today that I'll introduce in just a moment. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This is our monthly webinar series as a part of a relatively new partnership between the University of Kentucky's CEDIK program and the Energy and Environment Cabinet's Department for Environmental Protection's Brownfield office. It's been a great partnership with the state, which has allowed us to do a number of new programs, including this monthly webinar series to support communities navigating the Brownfield program. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We've got a couple trainings and webinars that we will share at the end of today's webinar. I tell you what, I think we may have a video issue here. One second. Kiersten, let me know. I'm not sure what may be going on, but if you can't get the video going, let me know and I'll see if I can do something on my end. My apologies.
No, you're fine. It's still not letting me in, but I can just talk. It's not a big deal.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you for being flexible. Well, great segue. Let me introduce our first guest here. And like all technology, there's occasionally a snafu here or there. But I'd love to introduce Kiersten O'Leary, the Brownfield Program Coordinator with the Department of Environmental Protection under the Energy and Environment Cabinet. Long titles today. And then lastly, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tyler McDaniel, the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky's Environmental Justice Program Coordinator. So today's topic is addressing environmental justice concerns in your upcoming Brownfield application. And let's go ahead and jump right into this. So really the flow of today's conversation, we're going to talk about the upcoming Brownfield grant opportunities. We're going to sort of dive into some of the scoring rubric around what sections get scored and where does environmental justice fit into that overall narrative and application packet. We're going to talk about some important definitions to consider as you navigate this. And also sort of share some screening tools that you can use to support your narrative with data. And then lastly, we'll jump into some examples of how communities with successful applications have included this language and addressed environmental justice as broadly defined in this application process for their own applications. So we'll jump right in here.
Hey everyone, my name is Kiersten O'Leary. Again, I'm with the State Brownfield Program. And yeah, I just, as a part of this partnership with UK, that has all come about because of the influx of funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law that Brownfields has received. It was kind of an additional $5 billion with a B amount of dollars that were pumped kind of into this program when this legislation was passed. And so this is historic levels of funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's been a huge focus on community-led revitalization efforts. There are more grants at significantly higher amounts, cleanups that weren't able to be done previously because of cost limitations are now rolling. And there's only 2 cycles left to apply at this kind of higher amount. Hey, there we go. There's only 2 cycles left to apply. So this fall and next fall are kind of what we're looking at in terms of like, if we don't get any extra funding for brownfields, it'll go back to the levels that it was pre-bill. So if you have priority projects, now is the time to start thinking about them and putting those plans kind of into action. All of these funds are used for assessing and cleaning up brownfield sites, and with a huge target on underserved communities and new applicants, people that have not been able to access brownfield funding before. And then as far as the timeline goes, this is kind of what we're looking at for this coming year. Solicitations usually go out in the fall, typically September, with a 60-day turnaround time, usually due sometime in November. It keeps kind of getting earlier and earlier, so just be on the lookout for those. The awards aren't announced until the spring. So, you get your application in, and then you're in a holding pattern for a little while until you get the notice of whether or not you've been funded. But yeah, and then the funding is usually made available kind of in the summer, and that's when you start working with an environmental consultant and really get started on your project. This year, they are not offering multi-purpose grants, but they are offering community-wide assessment grants, which is if you have a lot of sites to clean up in one kind of target area or a couple target areas, assessment coalitions. That means that there's more funding available if you partner with a couple of different non-lead entities, as they refer to. And then revolving loan funds, if you want to operate your own revolving loan fund, like we have at the state level, that's available. And then there are 3 levels of cleanup available: 500,000, up to 500,000, up to 2 million, and then up to 4 million. And then if you want to look at this link, that's where all of your grant application resources are going to be. So like past solicitations, you can go ahead and start looking at those. They really don't change that much from year to year, but that's where a lot of resources will be.
Yeah. And speaking of sort of past solicitations, we're going to make some inferences here about what we could potentially see in terms of scoring rubrics using last year's scoring rubric. The other thing I should mention is we do have a couple embedded links in the presentation. And for everyone that is attending, I will make sure that we get the recording sent to you in addition to a copy of the presentation. So you will have those active links. So don't worry about frantically trying to write down any web links. I'll make sure that you get a copy with all those active links. Sorry about that.
Okay, cool. So as far as the fiscal year 25 application, again, we're kind of basing this off of what last year's was, but historically, these are kind of your 4 big buckets of what's going to be scored in both community-wide assessment grants and cleanup grants: your project area description and plans for revitalization, your community need and community engagement, anything that's like specific to the project, what you're actually going to be doing with the funds and the cost estimates associated with those. And then programmatic capability and past performance. So you're talking about your organization specifically. So, 3 out of 4 of these, you could go ahead and start working on now, with a big emphasis on the fact that about 40% of your application is related to your target area, what you define as your target area for what you want to focus on, and the impacts to your community. And then the community engagement piece is also huge. Shane, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, one thing I want folks to understand is that while environmental justice may be a part of specific responses, or specific inquiry in the application, I just want to make a point that there are a number of places, roughly 40% of your application gives you the opportunity to start creating that foundation and describing your community and the community need in a way that also allows you to begin articulating specific needs to disadvantaged communities or at-risk communities, or those that have sustained long-term impacts from those environmental sites or potential sites. So, just think about, that environmental justice and that specific component around your community of need, that there are a number of opportunities where you can start to build that narrative in your application as you describe the site, the community, and how you've engaged those residents in planning for that site.
And additionally to that, keep in mind that you're building this narrative for someone, a reviewer or several reviewers that are likely not familiar with your community, and you have kind of limited space to be able to do that. So, we'll go into this a little bit later, but like the data that you pull to tell your story matters. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later.
And then just another quick example, very similar. The total points are different, but again, in the cleanup grants, we saw about 40% of those scored points being in those same sections. So again, thinking about starting to frame that narrative in each of these and connecting them in a way using that data is really sort of critical as you respond to the application or respond by writing the application.
So this is pulled directly from the guidance, and it's the same for assessment and cleanup. But so under the kind of second bucket, your community need and community engagement, that's where it's asking you to expand on environmental justice. And so 5 points of your application is going to be the extent to which environmental justice issues affect the underserved or disadvantaged census tracts in your area and how you describe those and the severity of those. And I just want to take a moment to point out, Tyler will give us a look at what this tool looks like, but the CJS tool, it's saying if none of the priority sites that are identified in your target areas or your description of your priority sites are located within a disadvantaged census tract with that tool, then the response can only earn up to 2 points. So 2 out of 5. So I highly encourage you, if you are doing some, one of the applications that might be more highly competitive we've seen over the last couple of years are the assessment grant applications. So when you are defining your target area, make sure that at least one or a couple of those sites are within those disadvantaged census tracts, and that you're going to be able to get full points for that, especially in those highly competitive grant areas. And then again, so advancing environmental justice is another 5 points, the extent to which this grant or the reuse strategy will advance environmental justice and minimize the displacement of residents or businesses. And I recently spoke with an EPA reviewer that said that if the application that she was reviewing did not address displacement in some way or another, that she automatically would not give them full points in that area. So make sure that you're answering every question to the fullest extent possible with the space that you have allowable.
Thank you. That's a great
And then I'm
point.
going to turn it over to Tyler to talk about.
Every point matters. And speaking of environmental justice, let's sort of move on, and I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to kind of help us walk through a couple definitions and sort of get us on the same page in terms of some of these specific words that you will see as a part of the application and RFP package.
Yeah, thank y'all. So we're going to dive into, as Shane mentioned, kind of defining some of these different words and terms and phrases that you're going to see throughout the application process. And then we'll get into some of those tools and how to kind of drill down into those terms and those ideas through these different mapping tools and data tools. So right here, we have a pretty long, broad definition of environmental justice. That kind of touches on all the different pieces of it: fair treatment, meaningful involvement of all people. So that dovetails with a lot of different things regarding race, income, national origin, tribal affiliation, ability. And some of that also gets into these, what we call the social determinants of health, which we'll get into a little bit more as we move forward in our definitions. But to sort of, without reading you that whole definition, to really start to break down some of the core components and kind of talk about where environmental justice comes from, we'll move forward and think and ground into this idea that environmental justice as a movement began in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. And there were a group of Black residents who noticed that there was going to be the dumping of this toxin-laced soil into a nearby landfill. So those residents organized, they mobilized, and they kind of started demanding more accountability and involvement in the processes that were affecting their own neighborhoods, because historically a lot of these sorts of toxic sites were located in Black neighborhoods. Now, since 1982, the environmental justice, the definition of it has grown a lot. And now the way that the EPA and Justice 40 Initiative and some of these other things frame environmental justice is they talk about it more as a people and community first approach that affects these sort of disadvantaged communities and other terms like that. And there's a link right here, as you can see, to sort of help to determine if your community and your census tract where your particular brownfield might be located is a disadvantaged community. And kind of they use a number of factors to determine what that might be. And a lot of that is kind of based on census data, some other kind of health outcomes in an area, income outcomes in an area. And really, once again, getting back to this idea that environmental justice has expanded as a definition, as mentioned in that previous slide, and now includes more low-income people, people with adverse chronic health conditions, aging populations, and that it really sort of centers that idea of community voice and public health. So thinking about, how do we involve people who live in a place in the decision-making processes that affect that place? So a couple of those terms to pull out from the previous definition of fair treatment, meaning no group should be more affected than another group. So folks in a low income neighborhood should not bear more environmental burden than folks in a more, wealthy, high income neighborhood. And meaningful involvement, once again, that idea that communities and community members should have a voice in the decision-making process and the impacts of these things that will be going on in their neighborhoods.
And I would just sort of add and going back to that previous slide on the rubric, that idea of meaningful involvement really is sort of critical to your community engagement, especially as you engage those neighbors and those residents directly impacted by those sites. So it gives you an opportunity really to focus on the folks who are experiencing those impacts, not only because it is sort of the just and fair thing to do, but also it will allow you to articulate a more sort of direct and intentional approach to engaging those folks that may not have had those opportunities in the past. So, one of the things, as we sort of move through these definitions, and Tyler and I will sort of collaborate on a couple of these slides, is that there are a number of sort of embedded little terms that you will see. And one of the ones here that we're sharing is what Tyler's already mentioned, this idea of disproportionate or adverse impacts. And these are broad impacts. So we're talking environmental, we're talking health related, impending climate related, or simply the cumulative impacts of a number of things. So, we may be talking about, a greater pollution burden here, or the consequences of all of those pollution burdens adding up. Or we may be talking about a particular community, whether it's a community of color or low income, again, tribal or indigenous affiliations, and then this idea of vulnerable populations. But really, the thing that I want to stick here is this idea that the impacts really can result from a bunch of factors. And really what we're looking at here is, again, that involvement and what may have precipitated those in either historic trends or policies that did not necessarily involve the folks who were most impacted or experienced those adverse impacts from those sites.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that too just kind of dovetails and plays into this idea of what's called legacy pollution. And these sites and impacts that have been in a place for a really long time, and that people have that have maybe been stacking on top of one another, and those could be a result of, like Shane said, those historic trends. They could be policy decisions, but as we move forward into the next slide, we'll talk about some of these factors that are going to indicate what a disproportionate and adverse impact includes. So thinking about things like how close your community might be to some of these environmental hazards, how susceptible they might be. So that's kind of where you get into the social determinants of health piece of that. So thinking about younger populations who are still developing, their lungs are developing, their brains are developing, and then aging populations and people who need more care in that way. And then how those communities like have access to hospitals, healthcare facilities. Are there grocery stores close by and where people can get good, healthy foods? And also considering those kind of cultural background or socioeconomic pieces, and whether that is, sort of unintended burdens from industry and the things that have made people in an area comfortable economically for a while, or even cultural pieces like subsistence fishing and recreational fishing, or even farming and kind of chemical runoff that can sometimes come with things like farming, soil erosion, things like that. So it's kind of these unintended consequences that can come along with these kind of cultural pieces that we don't often consider.
And
And
I think, that sort of leads perfectly. You touched on some of this, Tyler. And, when we're thinking about these sensitive populations that have experienced adverse impacts, really what we're talking about is those that are most vulnerable, right? Children, pregnant women, low-income communities that may not have access, or other sensitive populations. And really what I want to emphasize here, and one of the data points that we often pull for communities that we work with as we start our initial scans of potential sensitive populations, is the proportion of very young and our elders in our communities. Because almost every community we work in, when we talk about the greatest asset, it's often the people. And almost every community wants to take care of their elders, but is also concerned about how do they provide for the young people growing up, and provide them opportunities to keep them there. So, tying back in what we often hear in community engagement to what really could be sensitive populations that we may not necessarily consider sensitive populations, I want to invite us to think a little bit broader about how to really imagine what these sensitive populations may be.
yeah, and thinking about these ideas of underserved communities, of sensitive populations, of disadvantaged uh, communities, and how we define those things, right? And once again, getting back to kind of what I alluded to earlier of how do you even know if you are an underserved community or a disadvantaged community? And this executive order here, Executive Order 13985, defines underserved communities right here as populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life as exemplified in the preceding definition of equity. And then once again, within that, trying to define what equity means, right? Even within that order and that definition. And just sort of thinking about this idea of people being treated fairly, consistently, and impartially throughout like these decision-making processes, and thinking about how people are impacted by poverty, inequality, low income, things like that. So another piece of that is this idea of communities that are environmentally overburdened. So getting back to this sort of this brownfield piece of environmental burden and how you might be able to illustrate that. We will talk about in a second with some of these tools. But those are sort of some of the further definitions of how we drill down into underserved, into disadvantaged.
And sort of one last piece here, thinking about disadvantaged communities. We saw the emergence of what is referred to as the Justice 40 initiative. We'll come back to that and sort of hear how communities have referenced this in their applications. But really, this was again sort of established as a part of an executive order, and it recognized that communities didn't really like the term disadvantaged. It didn't feel right to them. So the EPA began using the term underserved communities, really to include those targeted in the Justice 40. And these are communities that they have targeted with the idea and sort of the goal of directing 40% of federal investments into disadvantaged communities, which is one of the reasons when we were talking about the funding cycle through the bipartisan infrastructure law, there is such a sort of a focus on supporting disadvantaged communities and those who have not applied in the past to get access to these federal dollars to address some of these legacy issues. Again, another link here to identify if your community is a part of those tracks. But just wanted to sort of highlight that as another layer that you can reference and look into, and data that you can use to justify your sort of location, position, and sort of connection to the broader environmental justice questions in your application. And again, sort of thinking about that application and community need, you know, we've touched on a lot of these already, but just to sort of wrap it up, you know, there's a lot of ways that a lot of data, frankly, that you can sort of dive into to help you justify each of these definitions, whether we're talking about health or socioeconomics or other environmental or demographic information. There's a lot out there. We have a number of resources. I've added the link to one of our previous webinars on finding the right data to tell your story. It's available. You can watch it in our library. But if you also have questions, you can always reach out to us. But we're going to share a couple other examples here in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to just kind of draw some specifics out about the types of data that we may want to look at that you may not have considered as part of your bigger and broader environmental justice sort of narrative and positioning your community in that application. So, you know, when we're talking about, you know, socioeconomics, we're talking about, you know, property values or tax bases, unemployed, underemployed, poverty, right? So percentages of your community under the poverty line, how you may find leveraging funds in your community difficult, or public assistance. Those are a number of socioeconomic sort of indicators, if you will, that you could seek out to help justify that sort of socioeconomic piece. And then, you know, thinking about, we've talked a lot about health and wealth, sort of the environment sort of broadly. You know, Tyler touched on a couple of these pieces. Healthcare access, asthma rates for children, especially those who are still developing or are under 5, sort of the incidence of broad illness or other sort of community health issues. And then again, this idea of vulnerable inhabitants, women of childbearing age, pregnant women, children, the elderly. But don't forget about your education levels and education attainment. And then lastly, sort of what I'll just broadly call the neighborhood condition. Or upkeep, the infrastructure, whether we're seeing illegal dumping, intense blight, vandalism, or other crimes in the community. These can all help you sort of describe and provide context to underserved or disadvantaged community as a part of your bigger application piece there. But I'd love to kind of move us into some of these tools, because these are really critical and in some cases required to reference. So let's sort of jump right into that, because that really will provide some reliable tool sets for you all to be able to use. Tyler or Kiersten, who would like to start?
Sure. This is the climate and economic justice screening tool that I referenced earlier. This is the one that if it doesn't fall within that, you know, disadvantaged census tract, that you might not get full points if none of your priority sites fall into this. So just put the link here. This is just one of the ways, but you know, especially if you're developing kind of an assessment grant application, I would think that at least one of your priority sites needs to be within a disadvantaged census tract according to this tool. So this is an important one to mark, especially if you're at the point where you're considering moving forward with an application. This is one of the ones that says, like, based on this tool, it needs to be this. So just wanted to put this here kind of as a standalone for people to reference moving forward.
And I think with that tool as well, I want to mention that you can't see it as much on the slide here, but in the sort of like the scrolling part over there on the map, when you click on your specific community, there will be a yes or a no. Like, is it a disadvantaged community? So it'll pretty quickly and directly tell you whether it is or not. And then from there, you can start to use that tool and some of these other tools to kind of figure things out.
And it'll also sort of provide you what percentages and percentiles, I believe, and how it makes those justifications.
Correct. Yeah. And some of the other tools available are this one, the EJ screen. Um, I just kind of picked a random area. So if anyone is from Richmond, please don't think I'm picking on you. Um, but I just sort of played with this map a little bit to illustrate a particular area and kind of some of the ways you might be able to use it to draw out a narrative. And hopefully this isn't too hard to see for y'all now or when you get the PowerPoint, but in this first slide, you know, kind of just having this area and being able to put markers on here for schools, for public housing, for hospitals, and for EPA regulated facilities. And then this also has a disadvantaged communities map, which is the orange highlighted sections here. So from there, you know, you can really start to tell the story of, okay, so there are these regulated facilities in proximity to these hospitals or to these schools. And then, you know, as you can see in kind of these next two slides, pulling out like thinking about, okay, particular areas, what are from these EPA facilities, what are they releasing to the air? And looking at that, okay, that's a very red section there in this area. And so, are there any health disparities that come along with that? Sort of getting back to that piece of the sort of socioeconomic and environmental factors that Shane mentioned earlier. And then you can see here rates of asthma are really high in this one particular census tract that is also overlapping with some of these toxic releases to the air that also cover schools, hospitals. I think there's some public housing in there and some of these facilities. And then, so you're thinking you can really start to draw out the story of this place and this particular site that you might be working on and who is impacted by some of these things in that site. And then from this tool, you can create a report. You just click on that census tract and click generate report, and it'll pull all this stuff up. Those reports are typically about 7 to 8 pages, but they offer a lot of information about demographic information, which you can see on this first bullet point over here, as far as seeing, okay, this area is pretty high, low income that's affected. And it also gives you these other sorts of breakdowns based on that socioeconomics pieces that we were talking about. And then as you scroll through it, you get some of these supplemental indexes and environmental indicators here that show you how the community and how that particular census tract stacks up when compared to the same issues or target areas in the state and in the nation at large. So you can really start to compare your specific area to these other places and whether it is above sort of their threshold even or sort of the average threshold. And really once again start to think about those ideas of disproportionate burden, of community need to alleviate that burden, things like that. And then this third piece is when it really gets into the nuts and bolts of the particular impact areas of toxic release to air, lead paint, traffic, and the income pieces, socioeconomic factors. Once again, being able to compare all those averages to the local place. And then this is just a collection of handy hyperlinks based on a lot of these tools. So this disadvantaged communities map is an Inflation Reduction Act one that pretty much just says yes or no if you're a disadvantaged community based on those IRA standards. The CEJST tool here that Kiersten was talking about, which is going to be your main tool in the Brownfields application. EJ screen we just talked about, and these final three are some resources from us and our colleagues in Extension that can kind of just, once again, help you draw out a lot more data about your county and sort of the needs and particular impact areas and some of that socioeconomic and demographic information. And then as well as the vast, robust library of Brownfields webinars that we have up to this point that you can go back and reference if there's a particular idea or question that you really want to expand upon.
And I'll include a link to the webinar series, but again, everyone in attendance will be receiving a copy of the presentation with these active links, so you'll be able to sort of navigate that as you want on your time. But let's jump into a couple examples, because I think this is really where we start to see the community need, the application components, the sort of narrative storytelling all come together. And this is really sort of where the rubber hits the road, if you will, in terms of how communities have conveyed some of these concepts to grant reviewers. So
Yeah.
turn it over there.
So I just want to point out that all of these examples are from successful applications out of Kentucky within the last couple of years. So I'm gonna kind of walk you through, I don't want to read word for word, but I want to walk you through, this is a community-wide assessment application example where they're answering that question that we presented in the very beginning, kind of the 10 points total for how you address environmental justice within your application. And then we'll do assessment coalition and then cleanup and kind of get a good idea of how people represent this information or, display this information within their application, because you do have limited space. And kind of the general rule of thumb is whatever points have more, if there's more points associated with a certain section, then you're going to spend more time on that section than others. And so environmental justice is 10 points of your application. And, when you're talking about highly competitive funding, especially for the assessments, community-wide assessments, you want to make sure that you're maximizing those points and spending an adequate amount of time on this section and collecting the most data from those sources. And I hate to say it this way, but like the most bang for your buck, kind of in terms of like what's really going to tell your story. I do want to point out, in this, they are referencing the Justice 40 initiative. It's saying that, funding this grant to this underserved, disadvantaged community will advance environmental justice and the Justice 40 initiative. They're saying all of these counties that are in this application are persistent poverty counties, which are defined as counties that have poverty rates of 20% or greater for at least 30 years. So that is an impactful statement right off the bat, that you're like, oh, okay, this is what we're dealing with, this painting the picture for me. All 5 counties are classified as distressed by the Appalachian Regional Commission. This is one of those tools that I don't think we mentioned yet, but I don't know if you all are familiar, but if you look at the Appalachian Regional Commission's website, we have a great number of counties in Eastern Kentucky, Central and Eastern Kentucky that are ARC counties. And if you look at the map, we have a lot of red counties for distress, and that map in and of itself tells a big story, and that designation, a lot of people are familiar with. So hopefully whoever the reviewer for this is gonna know that. But it goes on to explain designation based on continued high unemployment rates, low per capita income, and high poverty rates. And then they address the climate and economic justice screening tool specifically. So they're answering that question, and it's saying the city of this is as disadvantaged in 3 of the 8 categories. So it's saying, yes, this is a disadvantaged community in this target area that we're identifying. Let's see, reuse strategies will promote EJ by offering equal access to decision the decision-making process. That was the type on that one. Creating additional job opportunities, providing more affordable housing options in the target area and geographic boundary. And then goes as far as to address those sensitive populations that we were talking about. People of color and elderly are disproportionately affected by inadequate and unsafe housing. And so the whole goal of this, I guess, is to get more housing in this area. So this is one example of how you can kind of represent that within this kind of small space. And then I'll move along to the assessment coalition one. So as Tyler pointed out, doing that comparison, sometimes a chart, you don't always have the adequate amount of space for, but I think in this case, it really tells the story, and it's a good use of space for how they define this. According to EPA EJ screen, all 3 of the target areas that they're identifying within their application are located in Justice 40, that climate and economic justice tool, in disadvantaged census tracts, and contain EPA IRA disadvantaged communities. So right off the bat, it's like, yes, that checks this box. You can potentially get full points for this section. In addition to the socioeconomic disparity, EPA EJ Screen Environmental Justice Index ranks the target areas at or above the 50th percentile compared to the state. And then it goes on. These are, each of the blue things are separate target areas. So there's 3 target areas, and it's providing the comparison between the state and the USA total. And then the next slide is just a continuation of this question, kind of the part 2. And it's talking about how it will advance environmental justice by improving the health and economic status of residents, creating more jobs, removing blight and contamination. And then I like this part a lot where it's, this is an assessment application. So they're not actually going to do any cleanup of these sites based on this application, but it's communicating the vision and the want or the need. They've already thought about what their reuse plans are going to be at these individual sites or in these individual areas. So it's saying, a development of affordable housing in this county that is a target area, a youth center in this county, and then an aquatic center and the expansion of a city park in this target area. And so it's creating the picture in the reviewer's mind that these people have probably done the legwork to talk about what the community wants and needs, and instead of the blight that is currently there that they're going to be assessing. So I particularly like this example. And then the next one is a cleanup.
And one thing I want to add here, just a little plug for another one of our programs, the Brownfield Community Assistance Program, is that, right now we're working with a cohort of communities, and we'll be sort of launching a new cohort in the new year. But one of the things that we really focus on are supporting those disadvantaged communities in thinking about, in particular, if they do not have a strategic plan or a reuse plan or a plan on the ground to help direct future development, we want to help provide and support that. Because it's critical to be able to reference that community engagement, community vision as a part of acknowledging the other sort of things you want to assess or clean up. So again, just a little plug there. After we go through the RFP process this fall, we'll be launching our second cohort for the community assistance program. And if you don't have a plan, but do have these sites that you're interested in addressing, please reach out, and we'd love to explore what that could look like to support your community in planning for these sites.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a really successful kind of pilot year of our BCAP program. And yeah, if you have any interest, please let Shane or I know, and we can kind of fill in the gaps where needs are, to be able to prepare you better to submit an application, whether that's assessment or cleanup, next fall, taking advantage of those higher levels of funding. This is the last example that I have under cleanup. Awarding this grant to the city of blank, a disadvantaged and underserved community, will advance the Justice 40 initiative. And it's saying, again, that tool identifies this city as disadvantaged in the following 3 out of 8 categories. I think it just tells a good story, again, in that kind of small space. This one nods to the previous, kind of area where it says historical, industrial, and commercial operations have taken resources such as coal and timber for the area. And I think that's true for a lot of Kentucky counties. And again, whoever your reviewer is, might not be familiar, will likely not be familiar with whatever area you're describing. So, the more that you can kind of say that and paint the picture for them and make it compelling. It's saying when the economy shifted, jobs were eliminated, but the contamination remained. So they're still dealing with the impacts of this contamination, which is what brownfield funding is designed for, is to eliminate these kind of contamination concerns so that whatever those properties are, those sites can be turned back into a productive reuse for the community, whether that is an economic driver or just a community benefit. We're looking at green space and parks and things that are going to be beneficial to your community and not be so impacted by the blight that remains from that past environmental contamination. So Again, this one did a really great job. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. I just want to point out a couple of like tips and resources. First of all, being that we have past successful applications available. There's some older ones on our website, but I have some more recent ones. If you all, need to take a look at those, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to provide you with those just kind of as an example application. There has been a renewed kind of national prioritization of environmental justice, rightly so. I mean, this is an important topic, and I think there's been a real push to get this money in the hands of communities that really need it and have not had access to this brownfield funding or the levels in a long time. So, but if you have questions related to your application or specific site, anything that's like specifically EPA related, do that now before the RFP solicitations come out. Because once the RFP is published, they're very limited on what they are able to answer, not showing any like special treatment or favoritism or things like that. So if you have any questions that need to be specifically answered by EPA, make sure to do that now. Otherwise, our state brownfield staff is available to help along with CEDIK and Shane's team. Also NJIT, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, is now the technical assistance to brownfields provider for Region 4. So their technical assistance resource to the state, us, and then also to, all these communities in EPA Region 4. And I will say that their focus is on grant applications. Like all the TAP providers kind of have their own specialty, and crafting narratives and reviewing draft applications and things like that is really their strong suit. So, we're thankful to have them in our back pocket. So utilize them as a resource. Again, I have previous successful applications. There's another link to that tool that we talked about. Overall, there's data out there that will help you to tell your story. You just have to find it. Making sure that you answer every aspect of the application, not just putting like NA or not answering a specific part of it, like that's not going to get you full points. So make sure that you address it fully and completely. And then these are the FAQs for the fiscal year 24 grants. When the new guidance comes out, make sure that you're referencing the most current versions for everything when you're developing your application. But, this will give you a little bit more insight into, it's a very lengthy document, but if you just Control F kind of what you're looking for or that you have questions about. Also, if there's any conflicting information between the guidance and the FAQs, make sure to go to EPA with that or tell us and we will go to EPA, because they have made changes after seeing discrepancies between the two. So be sure to ask all the questions that you can, and we're here to help.
And speaking of questions, as we move to our last couple slides here, I want to invite anyone, if you have questions, I should have said this earlier in the presentation, but please feel free to add any questions in the Q&A box that you should see on your end on the Zoom webinar feature, and we'll circle back to those at the end of the webinar. But again, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A and we'll circle back to them.
And then here's just a quick example of an environmental justice project that is currently moving forward. This is in the city of Paris, the West Side neighborhood. There was an old transfer station in the neighborhood, or that trucks had to drive through the neighborhood to be able to access, as well as an incinerator site that was built in a historically Black neighborhood. Again, the West Side neighborhood in Paris. There is a link to this timeline. It's actually interactive, and we just wanted to highlight this as not only a great example of environmental justice and kind of what that looks like, but community engagement and information, like providing information, that's a big component of these applications, is making sure that you keep the community informed and that they have a voice in kind of a path forward. And you'll see this, it says pathway to progress. So this is an interactive tool that just kind of lets community members know where they're at in the process with addressing the issues that have historically been there and that they've been dealing with. So if anybody has questions about this, feel free to reach out. But this is something that we would like to see, more people start doing, something to this effect. It doesn't have to be quite as fancy, but it's definitely a good testament to how to provide this information and be able to really successfully get the community involved and keep them informed.
It's a great sort of, it just, I would really invite everyone to go to this when you receive the PowerPoint, because it is really cool and interactive. Each sort of milestone has a pop-up window that'll give you a lot more context of what that little component is. Because let's be honest, there are a number of things early in a brownfield assessment or brownfield cleanup process that really isn't observable by the community, and they may not even acknowledge that there is progress going on because there may not be much going on at the site specifically. And this is a way really to provide some nuance to that pathway. So again, just a great example. I invite everyone to check out at least once. But as we wrap up, I want to share a couple upcoming trainings and webinars that we have. Everyone is invited to our upcoming Brownfield grant writing training scheduled for September 12th. This is going to be our Eastern Kentucky grant writing training. It's free of charge. It's a one-day event where we'll sort of talk about the actual RFP and sort of what components, and we'll dissect it a little bit more. And then we'll probably do some practice exercises and think about how do we respond to some of these questions. We've recently held one in Western Kentucky, and we hope to be able to continue serving the entire state with these sorts of programmings on sort of geographically. But again, free of charge. You're all welcome to attend. We'd love to see you there. But additionally, our next webinar, and I'll make sure you get links to register for these when we send out the recording. But our next webinar will be in about a month, the end of next month, September 26th. And we are hoping and anticipating that the new RFP, the request for proposal for brownfield grants, will have been released by that point. And we're going to host a webinar really sort of touching base on, what has changed? What updates do we need to be cognizant of? Is there anything that communities really need to be paying attention to as we compare the current call that we anticipate in the coming weeks to the one from last year or those in the previous year? So again, if you're thinking about applying, this would be a great webinar to attend, just to give you some insight on any particular changes or priorities that may be emerging with that brownfield grant application. So with that said, I think we are at the end of our webinar. I hope everyone has sort of gained something, some insight in around the terms that you may encounter as a part of the brownfield application, the ways to define those terms and justify your response to those questions, the way to perhaps provide contextual information and other data to ground your narrative in these terms and these responses, and then effectively be able to use some of the tools to be able to document your case. Again, we've got some upcoming trainings that will dive a little bit deeper into this, and you all are certainly invited. But I want to give everyone an opportunity. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them in the Q&A. We'll hold here for just a little bit, just to wait for everyone. But again, thank you all so much for taking the time today to join us for this month's webinar. And again, we will provide this recording and a couple links as references or references to things that we have noted in the webinar, and we'll get those out to everyone who's registered. Again, if there are any questions or comments, please share them. Tyler, Kiersten, any closing thoughts while we give folks a moment or two?
I'm just going to do a little shameless self-promotion. if you have environmental issues in your community or in your county or in the region you live in, outside of the Brownfields program that you would like some technical assistance in, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm the new environmental justice program coordinator, and meant to provide free technical assistance for communities around the Commonwealth, connecting them to EPA and DOE initiatives particularly, and sort of navigating grant funding streams and doing other sorts of facilitation and community engagement.
Thank you, Tyler.
I don't think I have anything, just, thank you for joining us. If you have, we're all really well connected, so any of us can kind of loop others in on things that you have concerns about or questions about. And oftentimes, we partner on events. So if you have needs for trainings or things like that that were not listed, feel free to reach out to one of us. And, we like to kind of develop those. We're early still in our partnership together. And so we welcome any kind of ideas that would better help serve you all and your communities, especially moving forward with brownfield projects. We're happy to do that.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. Not seeing any questions. I appreciate all the participants and attendees here. And again, look forward to that email probably in the next week or so once we get the recording up, and I'll get the presentation and those links shared out. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you all next month. Take care.